Hello, class. It's Philip McLeod. We're going to be talking about the book we read, The Outsiders, and the movie we watched, Gangs of New York. Now, before we get started, let's take a little bit of time to understand that the book and the movie set place in times about 100 years apart from each other. Gangs of New York took place. It said at the beginning it started at about the second year of the Civil War, which was 1862. And in regards to the Outsiders, it was 1965. So when you consider the factor of the times that they lived in, racism was still very much a part of the world. And both place and in regards to both stories, they were both in the United States, and there was an influx of different types of people that were living in the areas that these stories took place in. However, when it comes to like the outsiders, it's all predominantly a classification of pretty much the blue collar class versus the people that had money, the socials. But we're going to get into that in a moment. Let's go ahead and let's look at all the similarities between the two, the book and the movie took place. All right, so the similarities here, both of them were pretty much all involved in gangs. Now, in Gangs of New York, they mentioned so many names of so many different gangs, it's hard to keep track of all of them. Now, when it came to the Outsiders, there was the only two gangs that were mentioned. It was the socials, which were the preppier, the rich kids, versus the greasers, which is our protagonists, the guys that had grown up on, I guess they would say, the wrong side of the tracks. It was all pretty much that they were low income, they were blue collar fellas, blue collar class. Now, the second thing about the both stories is they all pretty much had to do with fighting. And there was a lot of things in regards to the fighting when it came to the gangs of New York. They were pretty much fighting for survival. They were fighting to live, to survive, because the people that were in the gangs were pretty much the people that didn't have no other choices and they had to join groups to be able to survive, to be able to run in a pack, you could say. And in regards to the outsiders, this was more set up to be able to protect each other. Because if they were walking alone or so, they'd get outnumbered and they'd get jumped by the socials and they could suffer severe consequences when it comes to the beatings they would take. Now, when I say dress code, it's funny when you watch Gangs in New York because all of the gangs dressed alike, dressed their own particular style. Some of them had top hats, some of them wore certain colors or stripes or did their hair a certain way. I mean, they were all uniquely different, but when you saw them together, you could tell it was unified. It was like a uniform of their style. And when it came to the greasers on the outsiders, the greasers were pretty much the blue jeans, Converse, Chucks, t-shirts. They pretty much just wore basic, inexpensive clothing. And the socials on the other end were the rich kids, the ones that could afford the fancier outfits and, specific brands and styles. Kind of like, the situations that you see at school. You'll see certain kids that are wearing the more expensive clothes, and other students are wearing, what they could afford. And so when it came to the outsiders, though, the fellows that were wearing what they could afford were tend to be ridiculed by the ones that had the money to be able to afford what they wanted. So that's where the next one, how it says rich versus poor. Because over here in Gangs in New York, the rich were the politicians, it was the leaders of the gangs, the ones that had their hands in everybody's pocket, forcing them to pay just to survive. Just to live in New York, they had to pay certain people, like Bill the Butcher. He was the leader of the Natives, which was pretty much the strongest gang in the time period of gangs in New York. And he had his hands in everybody's pockets, even in politicians. And over here in The Outsiders, they didn't so much have their hands in anybody's pockets. They were just doing what they could to survive. They and have a good time also. They're young kids, going to the movies and, just walking around town. Being able to afford a soda was a big deal for these guys. Now, when it came to carrying weapons, these guys over here, the gangs of New York fellas, they had all kinds of weapons. They most of them carried knives. Some of them even had pistols, but they had some kind of like a club. They had sticks. They had anything they could pretty much fashion together to possibly hurt somebody. And when it comes to the outsiders, these guys had the basic, they had switchblades and, pocket knives, and some of them had pistols also. But majority of their fighting was pretty much done with their fists and knives. And they weren't necessarily trying to kill each other, but in the gangs of New York, they weren't fighting just to scrap. They were trying to kill each other. Now, when I say right here that they were born into groups, it's just meaning that if they were Irish, they had to pretty much run with some Irish folks, because if they were trying to run with American, like the natives who were supposedly American born and raised, they were never going to be considered a part of the crew. They were always going to be that Irishman, or they would also, the natives did not accept anybody of any other races. They pretty much were white guys that wanted to be the leaders of New York. And when it came over here to the outsiders, they didn't really talk about any other races. It was mainly about the poor versus the rich. And it was pretty much, if you didn't have the money, you were not going to be in that group, the socials. You were pretty much going to be running with the greasers, the blue collar guys, the guys that worked on cars and worked at gas stations and restaurants and stuff, the ones that were making it just barely to make ends meet. Now, right here where I say stole things, in this movie, that's pretty much all that's being done. The gangs in New York, these guys are stealing anything and everything. They're stealing from houses, they're robbing people right off the street. They're killing people and taking things. They're even taking bodies from people that were killed and selling those bodies to make money. I mean, everything in this movie is just showing how back in the 1860s, you pretty much had limited choices, so you had to resort to illegal activity to be able to survive. Now, over here, these guys did more of the illegal activity pretty much more for fun than you could say for survival, because a lot of them did work. They just weren't making a lot of money. So they would go and do holdups and steal things at stores and, just a bunch of things, because they were wild. They were they were the rebels of their time, I guess you could say. Now, when it came to the dealt with racism, you could definitely say that over here, Gangs of New York was a rougher time to live in, because they were out for anybody who was not born and raised in the United States. Even if you were, if your skin was a different color, you were going to suffer. It had a lot of parts to show about how Lincoln abolished slavery and the natives were against it. And the white folks in the movie were trying to act like they were going to become the next version of the slavery. And it just was a bunch of ridiculousness, but that's the way they thought back then. It was a pretty rough time to live in, you could say. Mid 1860s, there was too much going on at the time for anybody to be comfortable. Even in the movie, at the end of it all, when the riots are beginning, nobody was safe. If you lived in New York, you were pretty much fearing for your life. And when it came to the outsiders now, These guys, they just pretty much lived it day by day. You know, one day they'd get in a fight, they'd win. The next day they'd get in a fight and they lose. It wasn't anything like they were trying to exact revenge like it was in the Gangs of New York, because our protagonist in this movie, Valen, also who calls himself Amsterdam because he's hiding his identity from the guy he wants to kill. He is the whole movie is about him wanting to kill somebody. He's planning the murder. He's planning to murder the man who murdered his father. Now, over here in The Outsiders, they weren't trying to murder anybody, although there was a murder in the movie, you know, with Johnny, and, well, I'm sorry, in the book, when Johnny ended up killing Bob. And it wasn't by purpose, you know, it was a fight and something, and it got out of hand, and Johnny ended up stabbing him. And then he went on the run, and he was, you know, I mean, ultimately he became the good guy when the fire broke out and he was saving kids. But over here in this movie, Amsterdam was never a good guy. He pretended to be friends with Bill, because Bill didn't know who he was because he got older, and you know, his whole plan was exacting revenge on Bill. Crazy story. Both of them are excellent. I really enjoyed this movie here. I saw the movie to The Outsiders first, and then I ended up reading the book. And it's hard to choose between the two, but the book is better. After reading it and understanding it and kind of getting the idea of where the movie came from, the movie kind of vaguely went over some of the story as opposed to the book. And also there were some differences, kind of like with Dallas. They call him Dally in the book, and in the movie they had Matt Dillon, who had dark hair, brown eyes, and in the book here he was a blonde-haired, ice cold blue eye guy, which you wouldn't really, you know, I mean, I don't know how come they switched it up, but I guess it was to just kind of, because the movie's always got to have somebody to keep the crowd interested in it. So they picked a better looking person than what the book was actually portraying Dallas to look like. Alrighty. So when it comes to the comparing and contrasting of the movie and the book, they are both very similar. The only difference really is, if you had to choose a time to live in, I don't think you would want to live at the time of 1860 to 1861 to 1865, the years of the Civil War, because at that time it was very, very trying to live here at this time, especially in New York, when life was just not easy. It was a fight for survival every day. And when it came to The Outsiders, it was still an ugly time. The 1960s, that was still at the time of Jim Crow, where there was a lot of racism, there was a lot of hatred running out there. And when it came to the fighting between the socials and the greasers, you would have to just say that was petty stuff, because at the time, you know, as they got older, at the end of it all, they start to realize that it just really wasn't all worth what they were doing. All right, class. Now we're going to go over another lesson. Now we're going to go over the times and geographics of the era. Now, when I'm talking about that, we're going to talk about what comes to relating personal identity is clear in both sources. The protagonist, and we're going to understand that the protagonists were limited to their surroundings. And as an example of how Amsterdam slash Valen from Gangs of New York, the fact that he was Irish, he had to face the fact that he would be ridiculed for that reason, especially by the natives. The main gang of New York that were racist towards everybody. You had to be white and born in America in order to have their respect. and also in order if you wanted to join up with them. Now, also you got to remember that Amsterdam, whose real name was Valen, he was trying to keep his identity a secret the whole time for keeping his whole plot to kill Bill from foiling. He never mentions that he's proud of his heritage. He never really says he's proud to be Irish, but he has to accept it in order to keep his gang together. You know, he has to run with the other kids that are not exactly, what is wanted by the natives. They're just a loose group of kids that are stealing and doing what they can to survive. While many of the gangs had a style which they treated as a uniform, most of the gangs were very poor and lived on the streets. They didn't really have a style. They were just ragtag kids that had to pretty much wear whatever they could find or whatever they could steal or afford to just pretty much, get by. Now, as when it came to the outsiders, these guys were proud of their look. Even though they weren't exactly, rolling in the dough, they weren't making a lot of money, they preferred their style. They liked the jeans and the tennis shoes and the t-shirts and the leather jackets and the done-up hair, the 50s doo-wop. Well, not really doo-wop, but more of like the rocker, the hot rod style, I guess you would say. Even though they were considered lesser than equal by the socials, they didn't care. It was their badge of honor wearing the style they wore. Now, when it came to our main character, Ponyboy, and his brother Soda Pop, their older brother Derry, he didn't really have a style. He was just a hard-working young man who got caught up in a situation where both his parents died in a car accident, and he was trying to afford to be able to keep his brothers living in a home and feeding them. So he was not one to worry about style or anything else. His whole thing was making sure that there was a roof over their heads, there was food on the table, and the younger brothers were doing their schoolwork, and well, Ponyboy was, because Soda Pop dropped out of school. Now, when it comes to the style of the uniform, they took it seriously with the Greasers. They all had a certain look, and even though it got them in trouble, they looked to let others know that they were the wild ones and that they liked trouble. They were the ones that would run their mouth, and just like in the book, when Johnny, Dally, and Ponyboy go to the movies, they go sit behind two girls they knew were socials and start saying provocative things just to get their attention, letting them know that what they are and who they are. Now, when it comes to each gang from both forms of the media, they had to somewhat be organized to survive. I mean, just like example is, would the Dead Rabbits have ever had a chance against the natives if they were not able to hold it together as a group? You see, because the Dead Rabbits were disbanded at the beginning of the movie, and then Amsterdam brings them all back together, and he brings a bunch of gangs together to form the Dead Rabbits. If all the rest of them said, nah, you know what, we're good, we're not going to be part of that, then they would have been destroyed, before anything ever got to move forward. And if Amsterdam did not join up with the gang of boys he started with, and he tried to go after Bill on his own without ever being in the other gang, he wouldn't have made it the first few minutes of the movie. As soon as Bill realized that this loner was trying to kill him, Bill would have had him taken care of. And when it came to the outsiders, it's the same thing. If Ponyboy didn't run with the Greasers, the first couple pages into the book, he could have been done for when he was walking home from the movies, and the socials saw him and jumped him, and they pinned him down. They said they were going to cut his hair, but they could have done a whole lot more had the Greasers not showed up to save Ponyboy. Now, in the time of gangs in New York, the Civil War was taking place, and there was such a large influx of people that were moving from all over the world to America. With that being said, since the Civil War was also taking place, there was a draft going on, and the recruiters were lying to people they were enlisting. They were promising them 3 square meals a day and pay, and making it seem like it was a good life. But yet, as the movie went on, you saw that the soldiers that were just now enlisted were not getting fed, and in the evenings they would be bringing in the bodies of all the soldiers that passed away at battle, and there were even soldiers living on the streets after they lost parts of their, like they lost an arm, and the military couldn't use them anymore. So instead of helping them out, taking care of them, they pretty much just cut them loose and sent them back home to be homeless and just fight for their own to live. I mean, it was a rough situation. I mean, it was a lifestyle that nobody here would ever wish, even on their worst enemy. I mean, it was just an ugly time. And considering that with the draft going on, the one good thing about the being in a gang was the recruiters were afraid to go ask gangs or try to get them to enlist. They knew that they were going to get hurt. So they just pretty much avoided it. And being in that time of our lives, that time in the world, there was no social security numbers or anything of that nature, so nobody could keep track of if were enlisted or if they weren't enlisted. It was just pretty much a free for all, which it was a rough time. Nobody who would ever want to live in that lifestyle today would not want to go back to that timeline. The movie also informs how the immigrants that were coming over here had nothing to their names. So they were pretty much coming and doing whatever they could to try to get some money. And the people that lived in the United States, lived in New York, or didn't want to hire them. There was so much discrimination and racism that these people pretty much came here and lived on the streets if they didn't have family or friends that were already here. And that's where they had to resort to robbing, stealing, killing, whatever they could to try to survive. Now, with that also being said, most of the immigrants had to use violence and intimidation just to survive. But back then, even the police were corrupt. They expected to be paid off to stay silent and allow those gangs to continue committing their crimes. Now, when it came to the outsiders, we're talking about mid 60s, and racism was still deeply rooted in American society. But in regards to the protagonists, the greasers, they're pretty much, it was all based on their lower income blue collar status. They really were still a bunch of it doesn't say anything about them being other races. It sounds like they were a bunch of white kids also that, fought against the rich white kids. And it was rough, but at the same time, there wasn't anything about lynching or anything of that nature being spoken of in the book for the outsiders. But, like I've been mentioning, the greasers were honored for their for being what they were. They treated each other like family. The neighborhood, they all knew each other. They all hung out together. They protected each other, and it was how they survived. Now, when you take those times and you compare them till now, because we're talking gangs in New York took place in in 1861 to 1865, and The Outsiders took place in the 1965. That's 100 years from Gangs in New York to The Outsiders. But The Outsiders still 60 years ago, you could say almost 60 years ago from right now. And things have changed significantly over the past few years. If you think about it for The Outsiders' sake, the bullying situation, now there's a whole stop bullying movement. that's been enforced. So you don't really hear too many stories like you did when I went to school in the 90s or anybody around that time or before that. You don't really hear about, how the football players would fight against the punk rockers or the nerds or whatever it is that they're stereotyped as. It's just pretty much, it did happen. I mean, I went to school when that stuff was going on, but you don't hear about it anymore, which is a good thing you could say now. But the 20th century and 19th century were just filled with stereotyping and racism and just ridiculous acts that were really not helping anybody. It didn't do anything but cause problems for everybody. I don't know. What do y'all think? Anybody? Well, I know this is a new topic for you. It's two very interesting, very dramatic stories. Both of them are in tough situations that I couldn't wish anybody to have to deal with. But at the same time, it's good to know this stuff because this is in fact history. Although both stories are pretty much, well, they're fictional. At that time of life, that's really how it was for both settings. So you got to understand, even though the stories weren't exactly true, that lifestyle was. So it's a rough situation, and that's why we call it history because we got to learn from it, so that way it doesn't occur again. I mean, they say history repeats itself, but we've got to try to stop that so situations like we read about or what we watched in those movies never happen again. All right, class. Well, we'll go ahead and we'll start the next lesson about our new subject tomorrow. Thank you so much for your time, and I do hope you all have a great day and good luck in your next class.